We talk a lot, and I've written a lot, about the evisceration of our constitutional order. That the progressive statists reject the Constitution. They reject republicanism. They reject separation of powers, federalism, and you can see they even reject the Bill of Rights to some extent. And the reason is they reject individualism. Liberty is for individuals. Liberty is for individuals. And individualism is not defined by how much the government can give you. Liberty is not defined by how much you can lobby the government. Liberty is defined by this circle of unalienable rights that is around each and every one of us at birth. It's humanity. Mark, what does this have to do with anything? It has to do with everything. Our Constitution was set up to protect the individual in an ordered society. Our Constitution is the manifestation, the governing manifestation of the Declaration of Independence. What you're seeing play out in front of you is the consequence of the unmooring from our constitutional order. That is, you're seeing post-constitutionalism. It's always been interesting to me, and I've studied this for decades, how Marxists, socialists, whatever they call themselves, can talk about the people's revolution, doing this and that for the people, when in fact they're all about centralized, autocratic, iron-fisted government. Elites, who they call experts. Remaking society. They do not like a messy society where individuals are off pretty much doing what they want to do. Because utopianism is achieved by the experts, by the masterminds, ordering society. Mark, I still don't know what this has to do with anything. Stay with me, please. When you have the centralization of government, and I haven't written this down, I'm just telling you as it is. When you have the centralization of government, you have the government more and more making decisions. And you have the government more and more making decisions about everything. Big things and small things. Minute and huge. We have a massive administrative state that does that every day. We also have elements within our country that have gotten incredibly strong, much stronger, much more muscular than the framers ever imagined, and that's our courts, especially the Supreme Court. When you have the centralization of power, and when you have more and more decisions being made by the court, by entities within the federal government, then there's a lot at stake, isn't there? When the federal government's making decisions. The 50 states, the territories, are much less important, much less influential. As the central government gets stronger and stronger and more ubiquitous. You can't escape it. When the federal government makes a decision, it doesn't matter what state you move to. You can't escape it. It's a winner-take-all situation, like abortion, like Obamacare, whatever the issue is. It's a winner-take-all. That's not at all what the Constitution created. And so, in many respects, we have a post-constitutional government, a post-constitutional Supreme Court, and on and on and on. We absolutely do, and I've talked about that at length. I've written about it at length. So what you're watching now is the breakdown of the constitutional order in the United States Senate respecting the Supreme Court. And what's interesting about this is the institution of the United States Senate, as it sits today, is not what the Constitution created. It's not what the Constitution created. You had this progressive movement that became especially strong in its earliest period, the turn of the last century. the early 1900s, as it was building in the late 1800s. And you have the 16th Amendment, the federal income tax, which was always a desired result for the hard left. And then you have the 17th Amendment, which utterly destroyed the United States Senate. Senators are elected the way members of the House are elected. No, they're 6-year terms, of course. But they're elected by the people of the state. The Senate has no actual purpose anymore. Oh, I understand treaties and so forth. That's not my point. In terms of its fundamental, foundational purpose, it's been bastardized. The Senate collectively was supposed to represent the states collectively in the federal Congress. 2 members from each state. States would determine how they're chosen. They can be elected by the people, although a very few were. They can be selected by the state legislatures. Most of them were. But this so-called populism movement and the progressive movement eliminated that. And so you have this kind of pure democracy as opposed to republicanism when it comes to the United States Senate. And you see the consequences of that. You also see the consequences in another institution, the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court, even though some of my constitutionalist and conservative friends heatedly disagree with me, I've written about this, in the Marbury versus Madison decision, the Supreme Court seized power from the other federal branches. Jefferson knew immediately what took place, as did other individuals who believed in diversified government. You have libertarians today that argue strongly in favor of Madison versus Marbury. And when you really read the case and you know the history of it, it's a bastardization not only of the Constitution, but the parties involved. There's no way Chief Justice Marshall should have been involved in that decision. I'm not going to go down that road right now. I'm just explaining that the Supreme Court's power today is far beyond anything that was contemplated by the framers of the Constitution, and certainly the ratifiers in the states. The states were still very suspicious of the central government, and the Constitution almost was not ratified in Massachusetts, in New York, and in Virginia. Hence the Federalist Papers, the advocates for it. 2 of them from New York, 1 of them from Virginia. John Jay, Hamilton, and Madison. And they honestly believed that they had created a governing system that would protect the American people, not just from monarchy, but from mob rule. And more, we have both. With the permanent government in Washington, D.C., and the lifetime appointees on the Supreme Court, and mob rule, because of the unraveling of our little r Republican system. So you see the development of these factions. And the faction on the left has become extremely violent, extremely aggressive. Whether it's restaurants or airports, whether it's Antifa or Black Lives Matter, before that, other movements in the 1960s, the Weather Underground, and the association between these radical elements and members, elected members of the Democrat Party, is really quite shocking. Absolutely shocking. And the association between them and most of our media is unconscionable. Absolutely unconscionable. This is why the Constitution is so important, and this is why republicanism is so important. And the left keeps trying to destroy them. One of the reasons, if not the main reason, that you see the obliteration of the confirmation process when it comes to the Supreme Court, one of the reasons you see it is because Kavanaugh has professed he has declared that he's a constitutionalist. The enemy of the progressive statist, the enemy of the Democrat leadership in Washington, the enemy of the Democrat Senate members on the Judiciary Committee is the Constitution, truth be told. That's why they always talk about precedent. Not the text of the Constitution, not the original meaning of the Constitution. That's why they always declare that our original documents, our founding document and our governing document, are really illegitimate in many ways, you see, because too many of the people who were involved in the process were slaveholders. Therefore, they are to be dismissed or used in order to advance their destruction in the cause of progressivism. Again, you're seeing this play out in the United States Senate. Not to the extent we're discussing it here intellectually, but this is the consequence. Factions, defamation, violence. Now, we're going to take a look at exactly what I'm talking about when we return. I'll be right back. So the Founding Fathers gave this a lot of thought. They gave it a lot of thought. And in Federalist 9, Hamilton touches on this issue of faction. And the issue is very thoroughly discussed in Federalist 10 by Madison. Now, I know for most audiences, they're going to run away and do something else, but not my audience. I know why you're here. Because you're smart, you love your country. And the faction I'm talking about, we're up against this force, ladies and gentlemen. You and I revere this country, we revere our Declaration, we revere our Constitution. We revere individual liberty, we revere capitalism and private property rights. We revere our national sovereignty and our culture, just as the people who founded this country did. And they are under attack relentlessly, as are we. We are mocked. We are accused of things we are not. We are hated. We are at loggerheads in this country by a group of people who do want to fundamentally transform it, and those of us who do not. We don't mind change in your individual life, even change, if it's generic, in society. But by change, what this other force means is tyranny, centralization, control, power. That's not change, that's totalitarianism. Now, when these men, these white men, sat down to write the Constitution of the United States, they wrote the Constitution to protect all the people. The Constitution, despite what you've heard, does not promote slavery. It controls government. The Bill of Rights, adopted by the first Congress and ratified by the states, there's not a word in there about slavery. There's not a word in there about race. It's all about the individual being protected against the central government. I don't have enough time to get into Federalist 10 right now, but I will after the bottom of the hour. These are very daunting and bleak times, and I don't think even so-called conservatives in the media fully comprehend this. Because we're getting the same kind of reporting and media day in and day out, day in and day out. And the American people aren't learning anything. The American people aren't hearing anything. We need to remind our neighbors, our co-workers, our friends, and our family that these documents belong to them. They belong to them, not to the people who seek to rule us. They don't belong to these various left-wing causes. They don't belong to women to the exclusion of men. They don't belong to white people to the exclusion of black people. They belong to all of us. We're caught in this radical, progressive statist vortex where everything is defined by their agenda. Everything is defined by their language. We have a media in this country, largely, with few exceptions, which is also totalitarian in nature. Oh, yes, they are. You've watched them. You see them. They're propagandists. They advance an agenda. They're narcissistic. Jake Tapper can't get on these night shows fast enough. He announced that we need to hear from more women and less men. He's a man who has a TV show every weeknight. Has he given up his chair to a woman? How about Wolf Blitzer? How about Don Lemon? No. These comments by a so-called journalist are buffoonish, but they play into the narrative. They play into the narrative. You can't tell one of these late-night so-called comedians from a host on MSNBC or CNN. You can't tell an op-ed writer and a columnist in many cases from reporters at the Washington Post and the New York Times. And there's a reason for this. Because they're advancing an agenda. And they are undermining the whole notion of republicanism. So we'll address this issue of factions when we return. Let's take a look at the warning that we were provided by some of these great men. And in this case, Federalist 10. And this would be Madison. To the people of the state of New York. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed by their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions, that is, the state constitutions, on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired, but it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side, as was wished and expected. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. It will be found, indeed, on a candid review of our situation, that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administration. Stay with me. By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes. Bring my computer back. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one by destroying the liberty, which is essential to its existence. The other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between the reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach. The diversity in the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors. They ensures a division of society into different interests and parties. Now he goes on, you can see how brilliant these men are. Now what's he getting at? He says this is the nature of man. These factions, these passions. This is the nature of man. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. And we see them everywhere, brought into different degrees of activity, according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as of speculation as a practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, like political parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors, those who are debtors, fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of the government. No man is allowed to be a judge in his own case, and it goes on. Now, what is the solution as I now move on from Federalist 10? What is the solution? They say if there is a solution, it is republicanism. That the cancer is democracy and the pure are the worst. because that leads to mobocracy and anarchy and ultimately autocracy. And so you see, ladies and gentlemen, defending the Constitution. They explain what they've done in order to present this faction, which they viewed as a cancer. We've created divided government. A divided federal government and a federal government with divided powers with the states. A federal government with specific enumerated powers and all the other governing powers left to the states. Why? Why? Because you have a diverse people, a diverse geography, a diverse pre-colonial history, and diverse populations. And the way you bring them together is to not, may I say, molest their diversity. That is, attack their diversity. It's to celebrate it. And you celebrate it by creating this national entity, and yet by controlling it with checks and balances, with enumerated powers, by controlling the factions. And how do you control the factions? You heard Madison. Well, you don't destroy liberty. You create a government that is not a government based on pure democracy. You see, the founders of this country feared little d democracy as much as they feared monarchy, because neither respects the individual. Neither respects unalienable rights. Government is a necessity, but it's not the priority. Individual liberty is. So they created this brilliant document, this Constitution, to protect each and every one of you. These imperfect men, as all men are, as all human beings are, created the greatest governing document mankind has ever known. And then we have this force, this opposite force, that is literally destroying the greatest document mankind has ever known. The greatest governing system mankind has ever known. A governing system that is set up to control itself. Let me repeat that. A governing system that is set up to control itself with checks and balances, specific powers, authority left to the states and the people. And yet we have this force imported from Germany. They call themselves progressives. All tyrannical movements call themselves something they are not. The People's Republic, the People's Revolution, the Progressive Movement. They're none of these things. They all overlap. And what gets into their way is the limitations that are placed on them through our Constitution. Our Constitution has a hell of a lot of barriers. If you are of a different mindset, Hegel, Marx, Engels, Rousseau, their modern-day progeny, Bernie Sanders and his ilk, the Constitution is a problem. The Constitution needs to be destroyed while you claim to be supporting it. It needs to be destroyed. This is why they talk about precedent, and they never talk about the text or the original meaning of the Constitution. This is why they trash the authors of the Constitution. And this is why we have what we have today. This is a battle that is much bigger than Brett Kavanaugh. He is the latest casualty, and he is a casualty, and I feel very bad for him and his family. What's taken place here is a national disgrace. And yet, this force has revealed itself. It's revealed itself in the media. It's revealed itself in academia. It's revealed itself in Congress. And it's revealed itself in Hollywood. These are totalitarian objectives. This is a totalitarian mindset that you're seeing. Due process is thrown out the window. Presumption of innocence is thrown out the window. No evidence, no witnesses, no corroboration is necessary. Hang him. Politically hang the man. Or as I've been saying, throw him to the lions. Like the Roman Colosseum. And we are losing this fight. They've destroyed much of the Constitution. We go through the motions. The courts go through the motions. Members of Congress swear to uphold it. But in many respects, we go through the motions. As we live in a continually growing, centralized autocracy. I have the utmost respect, enormous respect for your intelligence. This is why I take this program where no other people will go. This is why I've tried to take my Fox program where no other people would go. And this is why we've taken LEVIN TV where no other people will go, and my books. I don't have to dumb down things for you because you're smarter than I am, and you're smarter than most people. Doesn't have to be by education. It can be by experience, or just you have a good noodle. That's it. But I'm telling you, these things you're feeling today, these things you're thinking today, these concerns you have today are absolutely meritorious. They are exactly the same concerns that James Madison had, that Alexander Hamilton had, who the libs now, they have a play, they think he represents them. He would reject them in 2 seconds. That Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, all these great men who created this government, had the same concerns back then that you have today. Aristotle had the same concerns back then that you have today. Cicero, the same concerns back then that you have today. Locke, Montesquieu, same thing. Same thing. Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, same thing. The men of the Enlightenment, before the Enlightenment, after the Enlightenment. You stand with them. They, the other crowd, that force, they stand with darkness, with bleakness. They stand with Marx and Engels and Hegel and Rousseau and all the rest of them, and they hate when I say it. What are you accusing me of? Exactly what I said. I'll be right back. Now, I got to do something I never thought I'd do. I got to give kudos to Mitch McConnell. Don't get carried away. Not generally. I think he's been lousy generally. But he's been very good on this issue with Kavanaugh. Very good. He hasn't buckled. Not yet. And he went to the floor of the United States Senate today, and in part, here's what he said. Cut 5, go.
Of course, mere hours after Judge Kavanaugh was announced, my friend, the Democratic leader, made the announcement that has now become famous. I will oppose him with everything I've got, he said. And not long after that, another Democrat on the Judiciary Committee proclaimed that anyone supporting Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation was, quote, listen to this, complicit in the evil. Complicit in the evil. These statements are the context for every action the Democrats have taken during this entire process. These statements remind us Democrats may be trying to move the goalpost every 5 minutes, but their goal has not moved an inch. They will not be satisfied unless they have brought down Judge Kavanaugh's nomination.
Cut 6, go.
Next, Democrats said the process should be delayed because too few documents were available from Judge Kavanaugh's past public service. Well, then they received the most pages of documents ever produced for a Supreme Court nomination. So guess what came next? The goalpost moved down the field, and the Democrats called for delay because there were too many documents for them to read. I wish this fight could have remained in the realm of normalcy. But when none of these tactics worked, when Judge Kavanaugh demonstrated his widely acknowledged brilliance, open-mindedness, and collegiality at his confirmation hearings, some chose a darker road. The politics of personal destruction were willfully unleashed.
And cut 7.
But here's what we know, Madam President. One thing for sure. The Senate will vote on Judge Kavanaugh here on this floor this week. Here on this floor this week. Our Democratic friends will try to move the goalpost yet again. Just yesterday, they submitted a list of 24 people whom they wanted the FBI to interview. So I'm confident we'll hear that even the very same supplemental FBI investigation Democrats had so loudly demanded is now magically no longer sufficient. Well, after the FBI shares what they've found, senators will have the opportunity to vote. We'll have the opportunity to vote no on the politics of personal destruction. We'll have the opportunity to vote yes on this fine nominee.
We'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
Now, I know you understand, but for some who listen who don't, when we're dealing with the progressive status, we're dealing with people who do not share our values. They do not share our values. I'm not talking about thou shalt not kill and that sort of thing. I'm talking about our values for freedom. I'm talking about our values for limited government. They do not share our values. They have embraced an alien ideology, and it is an alien ideology. And the question is, to the extent to which we are going to be able to defeat it in November. And that's my concern, that you all need to turn out. If there's a Republican you don't like, just hold your nose and do it. But when it comes to Collins and Murkowski, I think we as a nation, there's anywhere from 8.5 to 10 million of you, that we as a nation need to watch them. And if they vote or do anything further that is obstructive, in this case, we need to defeat them in the next primary with a third-party candidate. I don't much give a damn. I really don't. But that's what needs to be done. Now, Mr. Producer, would you please give me the name of a wonderful caller who's going to start us off really well here? Jane in New Jersey on the great WABC. How are you?
I'm very well, Mark. Thank you. And I just want to say before I make my comment, I love Life, Liberty, and Levin, and I was mesmerized with your interview with John Voight. And yes. I thought he was going to stumble a little bit, but I could not tear myself away from that interview because it's so refreshing that you ask a question and the person actually has an opportunity to answer the whole question.
Let me tell you this, my friend. Excuse me, my microphone dropped here. Let me tell you this. I've tried to develop something unique here, which is a long-form interview program where you have one or two guests at most, and you ask a question, you actually sit there and listen to the answer. And I listen to the person across from me, and I look them in the eyes, and I'm listening to every word they have to say. The next question isn't written down, ready to pounce. The next question may well be a question based on what they just said. And these are people that I'm bringing on the program who in many ways are unique, or they have a side to them you haven't seen. We had a wonderful guest on Sunday. Unfortunately, it was at 11 p.m. Eastern, against my wishes. And it is a program, it is a format that some broadcast folks, executive folks, and other folks they have trouble wrapping their mind around it. And yet when you look at it, not this Sunday, the Sunday before, we had the highest ratings of any show on the weekend on Fox, CNN, or MSNBC. This isn't to brag. This is to make a point that this model works, that the audience is smarter than you think, that the audience wants to hear people speak. And you don't have to just keep doing over and over and over again the same format, the same model, and just make it louder and louder as if that's going to make a difference. Anyway, go right ahead.
Well, you just touched on the comment I was going to make. I think the problem with liberals in this country is they have it in their mind that they're morally and intellectually superior to the rest of us. And you see these debates on those other stations that I don't watch, and they'll have 10, sometimes 12 people, and then other people standing behind them, and they're spewing all of their knowledge, and, you know, the American people are just too stupid to get it, and if it wasn't for them, we would be bumping into each other on the street. But I have news for them, and I believe this with all my heart. The American people are not dumb. We're not stupid. We're able to take
Well,
control.
some of them are. I mean, after all, how the hell did Schumer wind up in the Senate? But I get your point. Most of us are not.
Or Menendez in New Jersey. But we can think on our own. We can see what's going on. And with everyone that I speak with, everyone is so fed up with this. Nobody even bothers to listen to it anymore. So let them put out their hatred and their anger. I believe in the American spirit. I believe in their ability to discern right from wrong.
Well, I'm all in favor of believing, but we better get off our butts and vote. Otherwise, none of this matters.
Well, in 2016, they had Hillary Clinton up by 16 points on Election Day.
I'm well aware. I understand that, but I am saying that we need to vote. And we cannot rely on what happened in 2016 and rely on what happened in 2010. These people are more fired up than before, and we need to be more fired up than them. That's the bottom line.
We are. And tell your listeners to go out and vote. And I have this very great sense of calm. I was getting aggravated. I was getting to a point where I couldn't even watch the news anymore because I just couldn't deal with it anymore. But the more people I talk to, they feel exactly the way I do. And that's people in New Jersey. And this is a blue state. And
we'll find out. I've been involved in a lot of campaigns in New Jersey on this program. And I think we've lost every single one of them. So we'll see. All right, my friend, I appreciate your call. Look, I'm not against people being positive. But that's not enough. It's not enough to talk about 2016 and 2010 and the polls said that. I don't care about the polls. I don't care. We're talking about a battle that we're waging now. A battle. And the time to strike is when they think you're going to lose. The time to strike is when they think they've got the upper hand. That's the time to make sure. Look, here's how I view this. Every one of you listening to me right now, you're a precinct worker. For your family, for your friends, for your colleagues, for your neighborhood. I don't mean formally. I just mean on Election Day, and it's too early to say this, but I'll say it anyway. On Election Day, you make sure that the people you know who are going to vote the right way, vote. You get on the phone, or you tap them on the shoulder and you say, you better vote, and you better vote now. We do that, we'll be okay. I'll be right back. All right, let's get some of your input here while we're at it. Corey, Stewart, Florida, on the Mark Levin app. How are you, sir? Beautiful part of the country, by the way. You're on the air, Corey. Go right ahead.
Jensen Beach. Mark, I just wanted to say to you real quick, the beginning of your show, you do what you always do when you're educating us. You're very apologetic about the fact that you're giving us this great information, thinking you're going to lose your audience. And it's exactly the opposite. You know, people like me listen to you 15 hours a week because you're a cut above the rest in that regard, and you have so much information and knowledge to share with us that we can't get anywhere else. So,
well, you're very kind. Thank you.
Stop apologetic. We love it. And I would even go as far to say if you were to designate an hour or two on certain spots of your show each week, you'd probably find, if you were to designate that time for the education that you give us, you'd probably find that you had a bigger audience during those times.
Well, since we don't rate things that way, it's kind of hard to know. But anyway, you go right ahead. I thank you for your call. I appreciate that.
All right, Mark. That's all I wanted to say. A great show as always.
God bless you, Corey. You too. Very kind. Janet, Los Angeles, California, the great KRLA. Go.
Hi, Mark. I just wanted to
or as we like to say, 870, the answer. Go ahead.
Yes, 870. Judge Kavanaugh and his unfair treatment. I don't think people remember back in 2014, the Rolling Stone ran an article called Rape on Campus, where they basically destroyed an entire fraternity at the University of Virginia for a gang rape case that never happened. And
That's
yet
right.
everybody ran around saying, forget this fraternity, these boys are terrible, they should go to jail, blah, 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 blah. And yet Rolling Stone had to settle over $4 million in defamation lawsuits. And again...
Let me ask you a question as I listen to you. You bring up this case. You're not an old white male, are you? You sound like a young female. And I bring this up for a reason, because they bring race up every chance they get. White liberals particularly bring up race every chance they get. Tell me, do you think the vast majority of women in this country are left-wing, that the vast majority of the women in this country agree with them? And how is it that they presume to speak for all the women in this country on the left? How is it that Kamala Harris speaks for all the women in this country? How is it that this fool Blumenthal from Connecticut speaks for all the women in this country? Since when?
Since the last 4 years, it seems. But I'll tell you, it's frightening here on the left coast. I went to a speaking event that was run by the ex-president of Planned Parenthood in April up in San Francisco, and let me tell you, that was a frightening experience, because all of the women in the audience were eating up everything she said, that we need to take down the white Republican senators and lawmakers, and she's going to spend the next 6 months of her time after she...
You know, there is a great deal of sexism and racism in this country, and it's all coming from the left.
Well, you know, look at the Me Too movement and Asia Argento. She had sex with a 17-year-old boy. She paid him off, and yet she was the forefront woman running around with the Me Too movement. And you know what? The liberals have given her a pass, because even though she doesn't fit into their narrative, she was the one who started this fantastic movement. But we'll brush her aside. We'll forget about her, put her in a little drawer until we need her, and she gets the pass. And I just hope that the conservatives and these Republican lawmakers wake up and get it back.
I don't think they have. Can I tell you a little secret? You and 8 to 10 million other people? We have had very few conservatives running this election cycle even asking to be on my program. What do you think of that, Jeanette?
I don't understand it. And you look
they're running scared. How many of these people are actually running on their principles?
None. But the Democrats will rally around. They rally around Ellison. So there may have been some assault charges. Let's brush that aside. It was leaked yesterday to the Associated Press from their lawyer that they hired, lawyer Susan Ellingstad, who has links to the Democratic Farm Labor Party. And I quote, "An allegation standing alone is not necessarily sufficient to conclude that conduct occurred, particularly where the accusing party declines to produce supporting documentation."
And tell me, where's Dr. Ford's supporting documentation?
It exists.
All right, my friend, it's been an excellent call. You're very, very sharp. I appreciate it. Larry, Evansville, Indiana, the great WGBF. Go.
Thank you, Mark. Earlier you were talking about Federalist 10. Well, we know that, well, you do. 222 years ago, Washington warned us. Basically, you know, his whole farewell address is very interesting and very important, but particularly, and I'm not going to go into it, but paragraphs 15 through 19. Well, basically, in 2 words, he told us to watch out. He told us about factions, and he told us about those individuals that will use the engine to get into those unjust powers and then destroy the very engine that got them there. And so that, 222-year-old warning to us has been happening with us.
This is a great point, Larry. The world didn't begin today. Liberty didn't begin today. Tyranny didn't begin today. We have a lot to learn from the people who came before us and actually put their lives on the line. And, confronting a senator at a restaurant or in an elevator is not exactly a courageous task. But these are men and women who put their lives on the line. But look, Larry, look how they talk of them. Look how they talk of Washington and Jefferson and all the rest of them. They just dismiss them.
Well, exactly. And you can go back further than that. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, which you brought up so powerfully in the past, I don't know if the encounter actually took place, but it supposedly took place between Benjamin Franklin and Mrs. Elizabeth Powell. He wasn't saying it to an old white person. He was saying it to a woman. And when she asked him, what do we have, a monarchy or a republic, he said a republic, if you can keep it. So that warning came as well. And we're losing it. And to the greatest extent possible, we've already lost it.
I think we have lost a big chunk of it. And, you know, all the men who were thinkers and writers at that time, well, many of them, Mason, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, and so forth, they all said that what you need in order to keep a country is virtue. Do these people today on that committee sound virtuous to you, sir?
No. And when you...
Hold on. Do these media types who go on and on and on, do they sound virtuous to you, sir?
Not at all.
So we have a problem when our so-called leadership, certainly self-identified in the Senate and in the House and in the media, and also in our culture in Hollywood, simply have no virtue. They have no decency.
That's correct. And you had mentioned it once before when you had alluded to it. When I look into the eyes of these people, it said that the eyes are the mirrors to the soul. I look into the eyes of these liberal Democrats and the feckless Republicans. I don't see anything.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your call, Larry. I said, Dr. Ford, when you go through her testimony, we did it when we listened to the prosecutor, Rachel Mitchell, asking questions. And she put out the memo, which we discussed at length yesterday and will on LEVIN TV tonight, that Dr. Ford does not in any way have a credible case against Brett Kavanaugh. As I say, I do not doubt that she was molested, but not by him, because she hasn't presented anything whatsoever that can be corroborated. Nothing. Moreover, her own memory has failed her on key pieces of information, particularly as relates to corroboration. And her memory has failed her as recently as July of this year in her discussions with the Washington Post. Her memory failed her in terms of her willingness to fly, and I can go over a number of things. I didn't find her credible in the least when it comes to Brett Kavanaugh. And neither do the people on the left, which is why they're trying to destroy him independent of her allegations, with the most outrageous and stupid arguments imaginable. Digging up friends, quote-unquote, digging up associates, quote-unquote. Well, he threw ice. Wow. Well, we'll send him to Guantanamo Bay, except we only send terrorists there, and the liberals hate it when we send terrorists there, so I guess we'll send Kavanaugh there. Do you notice how the left hates us more than they actually hate our enemies? Do you see how they hate Donald Trump more than they hate any other figure walking on the face of the earth? How they hate Kavanaugh more than they hate any terrorist, any mass murder, any of them. Look at the ACLU. The ACLU has disgraced itself. It's actually running ads comparing him to Bill Cosby, among others. The ACLU. You've exposed yourselves over there, boys and girls. Due process. Only for Nazis. Presumptions of innocence. Only for Klansmen. But when it comes to Brett Kavanaugh, nah, he's a real threat. Why? For the reasons I said in the first hour. He actually believes in the Constitution. I'll be right back. All right, let's go. Victoria, McKinney, Texas, the great WBAP. Go.
Hi, Mark.
Hello.
It's just a real pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.
The reason I was calling is I just had a quick comment. Actually, a couple of them. I had an epiphany today for an old person. I just was thinking about in the news sometime back when Obama was in office, and they talked about his high school years. And if you recall, I think that he had admitted to doing some cocaine back in the day.
Yeah, he was a cokehead.
Yeah, exactly.
And a pothead.
My point. Judge Kavanaugh is the best. You can tell it. You can tell the guy is sincere and honest, and it makes me emotional, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I'm going to vote, and I urge everybody out there, get out there and vote, because I'm as fired up about this election as I was when Trump ran. Mm-hmm. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry, Victoria. Thank you. You know, over the weekend, I was in Florida looking after my parents. And at night, when I left them and I went back to my home in Florida, I was thinking a lot about the Kavanaugh situation. Not in the way that all the talking heads were. And I said, what really bothers me about this? What is it, Mark? It's the injustice of it. And how they forced a grown man, a federal appeals court judge, with an unbelievable professional reputation, how they forced that man to cry in front of the nation. I will never forgive them for this, ladies and gentlemen. I will never forgive them for this. I'll be right back. Gordon, Salem, Oregon, the great KSLM. Go.
Hey, Mark, I really appreciate what you're doing. I love the segment at the bottom of the first hour about the Federalist Papers.
Yeah.
And I wanted to add one thing to that.
Yeah.
John Adams understood that even republicanism that they were coming up with wasn't enough when he said that our Constitution wasn't made for, or was made only for a moral and religious people and wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. I think he really nailed that.
I agree, but it doesn't do us any damn good. We're living in the middle of this thing, and we're trying to save it, right?
Right, and that's why we need to get people back to religion and morality. But I also had a question. From the Kavanaugh thing, just watching all that nonsense, I'm wondering how many people would we have in politics if teen foolishness disqualified them?
Well, we'd have very few on the Republican side. On the Democrat side, how many people will we have politics of adult foolishness define them? And I think every damn one of them. Thank you for your call, my friend. And the worse, the higher up the Democrat chain they go. Bill Clinton's accused of rape, they nominate him for president. Ted Kennedy, with Chappaquiddick, doesn't require any further explanation. He's the darling of the left and always will be. Right? We can go right down the list. The White House has responded to this New York Times hit. Fred Trump has been gone for nearly 20 years, and it's sad to witness this misleading attack against the Trump family by the failing New York Times. Many decades ago, the IRS reviewed and signed off on these transactions. The New York Times and other media outlets' credibility with the American people is at an all-time low because they are consumed with attacking the president and his family instead of reporting the news. The truth is the market is at an all-time high. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. Taxes for families and businesses have been cut. Wages are up, and so forth and so on. Perhaps another apology from the New York Times, like the one they had to issue after they got the 2016 election so embarrassingly wrong, is in order. 20 years ago. We don't know why the IRS didn't look at it. They gave it a pass, says the New York Times. Isn't this fascinating? Now, who's going to do an anal exam of the Schulberger family, the Schulzbergers of the New York Times? I'm just curious. Won't be me, I can tell you that.